Welcome everyone. I'm showing 12 noon. So let's go ahead and get started. We do still have a few more people logging in, but we're going to go ahead and just kind of kick off with a welcome and talk a bit about housekeeping rules and the use of the go-to webinar panel. Because you cannot state it too many times, welcome everyone. I'm truly happy to see everyone logging in and joining me today. And I want to thank Kimberly Gray for the opportunity to be able to present. I believe it's the first Lunch and Learn, virtual Lunch and Learn series for 2021. And we have a great topic today, and I've worked hours. We have a lot of information go down to go over, and I'm really looking forward to get that. But before we dive into our topic, I just want to call everyone's attention to your GoToWebinar panel. And it looks a little different whether you're on the computer or if you're on a smartphone or tablet, but just a few features I want to call to your attention. If you haven't noticed, when you first log in, you are automatically muted. And if you have any questions or answers or questions or comments that you'd like to make throughout, I'd like to encourage that. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. If you look at the attendee box and you can see there's a little question mark, if you click on that, you can type in questions or you can enter them in the chat. Or if you just don't feel like typing, especially if you're on your smartphone, go ahead and click on the raised hand feature and I'll be able to call your name and unmute you, and we that conversation. I realize sometimes it's just inconvenient to type out questions. And again, I want to encourage interaction and have those questions and answers, because a lot of times it's that discussion on the topic that really gives it its best value. Also on the GoToWebinar, I'd like to call your attention, there's a handout section, and I've uploaded 2 different handouts. If you are unable to download those handouts or have any issues, go ahead and email me after. I'll have my email on the last slide, and I'll be glad to send those to you. What I've uploaded for you is a copy of today's slides, as well as one of the clauses in full pertaining to the Buy American Act. It's just cut and paste into a Word document, but it's kind of handy to see that entire section of the FAR 25 in full. So those are the 2 items that I have in the handout section for you. All right. We still have a few more people logging in. Again, for those that are just joining us, if you have any questions, feel free to click on that raise hand feature. I will be pausing every couple of slides just to see if I have gained any questions, because I want to make sure we're addressing them as they go through. And again, if I see a raised hand, I'll be glad to let you know and unmute you, and we can continue that discussion. So let me go ahead and close this up. And let's get started. So again, I want to thank AGC, the Associated General Contractors of Alaska, for inviting me to speak today. When Kimberly reached out to me, she said this was one of the topics that she had fielded quite a few requests to have more training on. So the Buy American Act today. But before we really dive into that, there's a few names that I see logging in that are introduce myself. And so again, I am Jody King. I've been with the PTAC for starting my 13th year now. Just had a 12-year anniversary a couple weeks ago. And the one thing that is consistent with government contracting is things do change. They change slowly, and there always seems something else to learn and to delve deeper into and to gain a better understanding of. And a lot of times when we're going through pertaining to anything government contracting, we have questions. Be the simplest question that seems like it should be a straightforward answer, and then you wind up digging into those what ifs, therefore, and the exceptions. So who can you reach out to help? And this is where I want to say, give PTAC a call. So I'm with the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC. And we are a federally funded entity with a cooperative agreement with the Defense Logistics Agency in the state of Alaska. Our grant is housed with the Business Enterprise Institute here at the University of Alaska. And what That means for you, the purpose of the existence of our program is that the PTAC program provides free assistance with all aspects of government contracting, from cradle to grave, start to finish, for federal, state, and local purchasing activity. So not only can we help you with those federal contracts, but we can also be that go-to for state of Alaska contracts, and by local, I'm referring to the municipality of Anchorage, the Greater Kenai Peninsula Borough. I think I might have added an extra word in there for Peninsula Borough, or even down to City of Wasilla, City of Palmer, as far as that local. And interesting enough, it also includes University of Alaska purchasing, since the university is a state entity. The PTAC provides free one-on-one appointments. You just give us a call. There's 6 of us. We have an office in Fairbanks with Pierre and Cassandra Sewell in the Fairbanks office. They're actually, we sublease space at the AGC office in Fairbanks. And then in Anchorage, we have our program manager, Carolyn Pratt, myself, our newest member, which is Craig Von Holt, who's doing fabulously well, joined us this fall when Gary Boucher retired. When we have Jacqueline Summers, and of course, Holly King, who's our admin administrator. And possibly trying to count on my fingers and talk, I might be missing someone. But ultimately, those are the main characters that you're going to be working with. So we do offer free one-on-one appointments. We have free workshops. We might have some special events or extended intensive training where we might have a small fee. But other than that, 90% of our of working with us is free. And the Alaska PTAC is one of 90 plus other PTACs in our national association, or APTAC, the Association of Procurement Technical Assistance Centers. And also there is a PTAC in Puerto Rico and Guam. So I've given you the website for ptacalaska.org if you want to learn more about us. I have a screenshot of our website in the upper left-hand corner. And also I've given you the address for our national association. PTACs work with that state and local, and if you are working with a company that has multiple offices in multiple locations, it's good to reach out to those PTACs for those different states, because each one of us specializes in that state and local contract for our own state. So I can work with you on Alaska contracting. We couldn't even begin to give you the first information on state of Colorado or state of Washington. So it's good to know, reach out, take advantage. We're free service. It's a great program. It's been around from the 80s. We're here to help. So got my little bit of marketing spiel and the why PTAC. And let's go ahead and delve into our topic today. It's a short list, but we are going to be looking at a lot of things. So we're going to talk about reviewing the Buy American Act. So I'm going to actually look at the act itself. We're going to look at the related clauses, both the FAR and DFAR. We're going to talk about the Impact of Trade Agreements Act, or TAA. And I have a brief one slide comment, just Barrie Amendment, just so that you're familiar with that as well. And then depending on time remaining, we might look at a few things in solicitations I have primed, but again, that's a time remaining issue. So here is the Buy American Act in full. Big screen full of a lot of text, and I am not even going to delve in it on this screen. Instead, I wanted to break it down into components so that we can talk about it. I did want to provide it to you in full along with a clickable link to take you to that section for the US Code where you can read the Buy American Act. All right, so Buy American Act really comes down to allowable materials. So if you look here, we have a two-part thing that we're going to be talking about, allowable materials and then exceptions. So only under the allowable materials, it says only unmanufactured articles that have been mined or produced in the United States, or unmanufactured article material supplies that have been manufactured in the US, substantially from all article material supplies mined, produced, or manufactured. So we have mined or unmined, or we have articles that have been manufactured within the US. So before we even really go much further, let me preference this by stating, when we're looking at the solicitation, often we'll see the FAR clauses, and we'll get into those in more detail, that state that we just see the Buy American Act in full or sometimes even in reference, depending on the agency and how they've deemed the importance of that particular clause. And what we're really looking at is what does it entail? And the Buy American Act does apply to all aspects of contracting, both whether you're doing a supply purchase, services, if there's a material component act, and of course construction. And we'll look at the construction clause towards the end of the presentation. So the allowable materials, again, we're either mining them or we're growing them, producing them, that agricultural, or we are making them ourselves. So if you look in blue, it says this, in essence, this statement is restricting the purchase of supplies that are not domestic end products for use within the United States, unless, and here's the rest of that, unless the head of the department or an independent establishment concerned determines their acquisition to be inconsistent with the public interest or their cost to be unreasonable. So in other words, we're going to restate it here in blue, a foreign or non-domestic end product may be purchased if the contracting officer determines that the price of the lowest domestic component offer is unreasonable or if another exception applies. So already we're taking a simple statement and now we're adding our exceptions, because government contracting, we always have our absolutes, you shall do this, and then we caveat with unless or exceptions or alternatives. So in other words, the Buy American Act seemingly prohibits the acquisition of non-domestic products and construction materials, but however, in practice, this act serves as a price preference for products. So we're going to start thinking this, instead of it must be a Buy American product, we're going to have a price preference for domestic end products. And we're going to get into the terminology in that, and looking at the terminology really kind of helps winnow this out. Because ultimately what we have is a lot of language with a very simple premise, that for purchases by the federal government for use, domestic use within the US, that when the federal government is spending, we want to encourage them to be buying products, services that are, again, domestic end product to help keep the American economy strong and healthy, help support businesses. However, that is not always the case where we can, whether due to availability, depending upon the product, we might not be the #1 manufacturer for that particular product. In that case, there are times when a non-domestic end product is preferable, and here's how we'll go ahead and talk about when that's the case. So let's dig a little bit into some of the terminology. Okay, so end product, and this part is really critical. It's understanding the terminology. So the end product means those articles, materials, or supplies to be acquired for public use. Something as simple as a new toaster for one of the federal buildings, or construction equipment, construction supplies. Domestic end products are those that are unmanufactured end products mined or produced in the United States, or an article, material, and or supply that has a two-part test for manufactured products. So the two-part test consists of the article must be manufactured in the US, and the cost of domestic components must exceed 50% of the cost of all components, or be a commercially available off-the-shelf cost, because we're going to throw something in there to make it just a little bit more confusing. So to have a domestic end product, what that means is, again, we are going to take a look at our shopping list of ingredients that we have used to create this final end product that then is going to be delivered or installed, or possibly, in case of construction, built for use for the federal government. And we're going to look at all these different components, and we're going to look at their country of origin for each one of them, and we're going to determine if at least 50% of that cost for a manufactured article, so again, in the case of agriculture, we're not just picking it, processing, and here it is for sale, but that manufactured cost is, again, incurred within the US. So again, definition: component means an article, material, supply incorporated directly into an end product. Component costs. So this is where we start calculating, are we determining if this is a domestic end product or not? So component costs, these include cost purchased by the contractor, the acquisition costs, transportation costs, duty costs. So if we are bringing in imported, we can include some of that transportation and duty costs. If it's manufactured by the contractor, we're looking at the costs associated with the manufacturing process, including transportation costs, plus the allocable overhead cost, excluding a profit. So no profit, and we're not including labor costs. So again, if there's question on that allocable overhead cost, that goes back to that FAR Part 31 for allowable and allocable when we're dealing with pricing for the federal government. So in the last bullet, the component cost does not include any costs associated with the manufacture of the end product, which seems a little counterintuitive, but again, we're talking about looking at those costs of the components and with all of that thrown together, our kettle of soup, what are those costs? How much of that is from domestic and how much of that is imported? If we can show that more than 50% of those costs are indeed domestic, then we have a domestic end product. So on the commercial off the shelf, the COTS, the FAR Part 2.101, here's the definition. So it's a commercial item, it's sold in substantial quantities, and it's offered to the government under a contract, subcontract, in a tier without modification. So basically, we are able to go in, if we're looking at component parts, Lowe's, Alaska Industrial Hardware, Spinard Builder Supply, and we're buying those component parts that we are used to build the whole. The one thing with if we're using commercially available products is we don't necessarily need to delve into the component cost to make that final product. One of the things, a great example is, say we are buying a fan, and that may be a component into construction, and if we're buying that fan that's going to be installed, then we're looking at that fan country of origin, but we don't necessarily have to, what are all the components, where each of the little components of that fan, commercial off the item shelf, we don't have to delve into the manufacturing. You do need to know the country of origin. So regarding COTS, one, they are offered to the federal government without modification. So the moment that we are taking a commercial item and modifying for government use, it loses that designation of COTS, that commercial item. And then we're talking about substantially transferring the problem, transforming. COTS do not have to meet the cost of component requirement, and I kind of briefly discussed that above. And also, again, I'm going to state this, it's really important to understand and be able to identify the country of origin in order to calculate those component costs. All right, manufactured, a couple tidbits. So one, for the word manufactured, there is no regulatory definition of what it means to be manufactured. In essence, it's been developed by case law through GAO, Board of Contract Appeals, and federal courts. Ultimately, the definition of manufactured is that completion of an article in the form required by the use for the government. So it's created from component parts, or it's retrofitted, adjusted, assembled, redesigned. That substantial transformation. We're going to see the importance of this terminology when we get into some clauses further on. So manufactured. Country of origin, we talked about this a little bit, but what I wanted to do is to give you the actual, where do you go to define that? There's a great article here. I have the link for it. What is the country of origin? And then according to Part 134.1 of the custom regulations, country of origin means the country of manufacture, production, growth, and article of a foreign origin entering the United States. So here's some great information. And a good resource for determining, here we go, customs, US Customs for determining country of origin. That termination substantial transformation, and this really can get into the weeds, but if you're looking at potential protest or other concerns, whether your competitor is truly using Buy American or meeting the requirements, his price proposal has been fairly determined to meet the Buy American Act, then this substantial transformation and the definition of substantial transformation becomes really critical. Ultimately, it wants to know that the good underwent a fundamental change, normally as a result of processing or manufacturing in the country, climate, origin, in form, appearance, nature, or character, which adds value. So in other words, if we are bringing in, let's talk about surgical gowns, all the things going on with COVID right now and the PPE that we're buying, and the government is searching for and still buying in leaps and bounds. If we are looking at that Buy American Act and we are a manufacturer, are we just buying the fabric? The fabric may be coming in from a foreign country. It's not, the fabric itself isn't necessarily a US made product, and we're looking at that and we're taking these components and then we're substantially transforming into that end article, versus are we getting completed gowns and then we are simply repackaging, sterilizing, maybe putting it together in other kits, but what we're doing is just, we're not making a substantial transformation. We're just taking something, reshuffling it, and moving on. So again, that substantial transformation really becomes one of those critical definitions when we're talking about, is this an domestic end product? All right, exceptions. So I'm kind of back to that first clause. I had to throw some terminology in there. This is why you can see most FAR clauses start off with the definitions and then dig into the clause itself. So here's the exceptions. So this section does not apply, when this is back to that Part 1 of the Buy American Act, to articles, materials, or supplies for use outside of the United States. If articles, materials, or supplies in the class or kind to be used, or the articles, materials, or supplies from which they are manufactured are not mined, produced, or manufactured in sufficient and reasonably available commercial quantities, then we can have an exception to the Buy America Act. Or C, is not more than the micro purchase threshold. So just for your information, that did increase for supply. It's up, the micro purchase threshold is now 10,000. That was finalized this past fall for all agencies. So if we are purchasing, if the agency is purchasing under that micro purchase threshold, then the Buy America Act does not apply. For construction and service, that threshold has not changed, simply because we have the Davis-Bacon Act, the Service Contract Act, that set that ceiling. So we have statute that sets the ceiling for those micro purchase thresholds for those construction and services. Okay, so here's the first clause. So just to recap, bear with me here. We are talking about allowable materials must be domestic end product unless it doesn't work due to our exceptions. And what are we going to do in the case of the exceptions? So let's talk about the predominant clause that we're going to see, or the FAR subpart that defines how we're going to incorporate this Buy American Act. So in essence, we can see right here, the Buy American Act restricts the purchase of supplies that are not domestic end products. So we've kind of gone all over that terminology. A foreign end product may be purchased if the contracting officer determines that the price of the lowest domestic offer is unreasonable, or if another exception applies. And then we can see subpart 25.1. So this is just the general information. Segment B, the restrictions of the Buy American Act statute are not applicable in acquisitions subject to certain trade agreements. And we're going to talk about those as well. In these acquisitions, end products and construction materials from certain countries receive non-discriminatory treatment and evaluation with domestic offers. So let me give you a story on this. So I was working with a company that had a sole source award. They were in that negotiation process. It was a civilian agency, and it was a construction project for remote areas southeast. And there was, of course, the Buy American Act. The clauses, the Buy American Act for construction materials was also incorporated in the solicitation. And it came down to the price of the overall product, and the contracting officer was starting to push back on the business that the costs are too high, you're over our budget, we need you to reduce costs. And then it became a discussion of some of the supplies, and this was for a roof. They were re-roofing existing, that wasn't even a all new construction. And in the materials that had been specifically called out that all materials must be Buy American, and some of the costs that they were looking for of the different components were exceptionally high because there was a limited number of manufacturers, there was some long lead time on some of the products, and it was significantly increasing the cost when there were other components that were produced in countries that fell under the trade agreements that could then be deemed as allowable under the Buy American Act. And the contracting officer and the technical rep were absolute that every single component of that contract absolutely had to be made in America supplies. They were not allowing any alteration of this. Ultimately, we referred them over to the procurement center rep over at the SBA to kind of negotiate some of that since it was under the 8A, and I didn't find out ultimately what happened. But in that case, we were talking about, yes, there is a domestic product, but it has a limited quantity. It's not readily available, and the cost of it was significantly higher than other non-domestic products. And we see right here under the general 25.001 that the contracting officer can determine that the price of the lowest is unreasonable and allow other exceptions. Okay, so let's get back, move on from that. Oops, bear with me a second. And again, I just have the clause here if you want to see the language in full. So continuing on, it says the test to determine the country of origin for the end of product. And we kind of talked about that a little bit in the definition, so I'm not going to go over that. Here it also discussed the Buy American statute uses a two-part test to define, and we discussed this as well. So again, we're seeing the clause in the definition. And under trade agreements, the test to determine country of origin is that substantial transformation. And again, that's where we're taking those components and bringing them into the US, and if we are using them or they are becoming part of a whole new application. And here for the representation, it's 52.225.18, only the criterion in which the place of manufacture of an end product is in the United States. Okay, so let's move on. The American Act applies to. So in essence, the Buy American Act itself is a price preference program. It's pretty simplistic. You're going to buy American, you're going to pull American products that are either mined, grown, produced, or manufactured. And if you can't, there is a process to be able to use otherwise. Now, the Buy American Act is going to apply to all small business set-asides, regardless of the dollar value. And that dollar value threshold is where some of the trade agreements start kicking in. It also applies to all sole source acquisitions, regardless of the dollar value. It also applies to certain other contracts, regardless of the dollar value, including certain purchase for arms or war materials. So we start getting into the Department of Defense. And the Act does not apply to contracts for supplies acquired for use outside of the United States. Now, there is a DoD nuance we were talking about when we were war. So the balance of payment program, which is in the Department of Defense FAR, requires domestic end products for use outside of the United States. So if you're looking at a civilian agency for use overseas, then the Buy American Act is not applicable. If we are spending DoD funds for use for DoD activity outside of the US, then the Buy American Act is applicable due to this, if that FAR clause balance of payment program is incorporated, and also depending on the activity or the purchase, the Barrie Amendment might kick in. And we'll save the Barrie Amendment for last. All right, so exceptions to the Buy American Act applicability. So we talk about public interest. So if the agency had determined that domestic preference would not be in the public interest. And then one of those factors could be time delays for availability, or again, cost. If we can get the domestic product at a significant cost reduction, then possibly that might be the way to go. We have talk about non-availability, articles, materials, supplies that aren't produced, insufficient. We've kind of listed that. Here's one of the things I wanted to pull out here. I'm not going to go over into the entire list, but FAR 25.104 is a predetermined list of items that are already deemed not available in sufficient quantity in the US and therefore aren't subject to the Buy American Act. And so if you're ever curious, there is the list. Resale at commissaries, an agency can buy foreign end products for stocking the commissaries for use for resale for the commissary, so there's an exception. IT is a commercial item, internet programming, so that's one of the things as a commercial item that removes the applicability for the Buy American Act. And of course, unreasonable cost, which is really that highlighted. This is the exception in practice that makes the BA statute that provides a price preference on domestic programs. So really that's how we were looking at the Buy American Act. It is that price preference on domestic products. All right, so there are 3 separate pricing preferences depending on low domestic offer size. So this is the price preference. So we had mentioned that we're saying Buy America unless you can't, or unless there's cheaper alternatives. And how are we going to determine, how is the contracting officer going to determine that that non-domestic preference is in fact better for agency need because of the price differential? So in that case, as the contracting officer, if they're in the civilian agency, they are actually going to post a price penalty on the non-domestic components. So if the contractor with the lowest price domestic end product is a large business, so here's our if-thens, the agency will add a price evaluation penalty to the low foreign end product of 6%. If the contractor with the lowest price domestic end product is a small business, the agency adds a price evaluation penalty of 12%. So there is that government supporting their small business programs by allowing that price differential. So if we have a list of products, we have both domestic, we have non-domestic, we're going to look at that lowest domestic price, and we're going to add these differentials to the foreign products and see where that cost function falls out. The Department of Defense instead has their own nuance. They're going to add a 50% price evaluation penalty to low foreign end products, regardless whether the contractor with the lowest is large or small business. So civilian agency, large businesses, and we're looking at the competition for that component, then we're having a 6% penalty added, and we're looking at that for that preference. And if it's a small business, then 12%. So ultimately what they're doing is they're determining for that price factor, which is the best, if it is still the domestic end product is the most reasonable for that component of supporting the Buy America Act. The domestic offer is, so just restating, if the domestic offer is reasonable, if it does not exceed the evaluated price of the low offer and addition of the price with the additional price evaluation penalty. So again, they're applying that preference or that preference penalty. And again, just for general information, that is an evaluation factor. It doesn't necessarily mean that that impacts the actual price itself. FAR clauses. So this is where that tire, what is it on the tires, the rubber meets the road. This is what we really are looking for when we're looking at solicitations. So we have the 52-225 -1, which is this for supplies, 225-2, which is for certificate, -9, which is the construction materials, and this 225-10, notice of Buy American Act, again for construction materials. And I've spent quite a bit of time going through current solicitations, and what I wanted to see, are the agencies following through, and what are these looking like, these clauses within the solicitation itself. And so I did look at several civilian agencies and several of DoD contracts as well. And we're going to talk about these clauses a little bit more. So let me move on. Bill, I see a question. Let me pull that up. Give me 2 seconds here, pull up the question box. All right, so Bill asked if I could expand on 2 items, COTS. Would it be a correct statement to say if a box of material such as concrete anchors is a commercially produced item and available for all purchase, it can be used as the BA construction job even if produced outside of? Yes, I would agree with that statement, Bill. So if you are, but here's my offset to this. So if the concrete anchors is a non-domestic end item, but we are looking at the overall components used to have that completed end use product, if all of the other components then, when we're hitting that benchmark of that 50% cost for domestic end product, then yes, using those COTS of those small, the concrete anchors is applicable to use that off-the-shelf item. Make sense? Now, if you have an option, same product, and you know one box of the anchors is American made within the US, and the other is an import, then we can start talking about the trade agreements. Say if it's from Canada or Japan where we have a trade agreement, then that, whether it's domestic or not domestic, is removed from consideration, and either way, then that COTS item absolutely meets the definition for the Buy American Act and trade agreement. And we'll get into trade agreements again. So long story short, long explanation stripped down, it really depends on if all you are doing is selling and those concrete anchors are going to be a standalone, say you're selling it to national parks, they're going to use it in construction, then I would clarify if that is acceptable with the contracting officer just to avoid headache down the road. If it's a component part to have an end product, and again, you're still all the other costs, then absolutely that would work. Hopefully that answers your question, Bill. I know there's still too many if-thens. If you have questions, feel free to get a hold of me after the fact, after the webinars. Let me get going so I don't run out of time. Thank you for that question. Okay. So we have a look at our clauses, and I wanted to call out the Buy America certificate. And of the 5 solicitations I checked, absolutely for every solicitation that had the Buy American Act incorporated, the Buy American Act certificate was also listed. Oftentimes it was listed as referenced by number, but in essence, that entire clause still is applicable for the solicitation. So please pay attention to that. Again, make sure that you're completing those certificates and submitting it. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about possible penalties. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I just want to call out that if you are submitting a solicitation and you've completed, we've read the clause, we are stating that we are submitting, we're in compliance with the Buy American Act, we've completed our certificate, calling out whether we have domestic or non-domestic. Here's our certificate. And it turns out that we were incorrect. There are penalties for Buy American Act fraud. And false certification can result in protests, False Claims Act, suspension, debarment, and of course other civil and criminal penalties depending on the intent. There's a great article here. I just wanted to call that out for your attention. If you really want to get more history of cases where fraud has been pursued against companies that had used the Buy American Act with bad intentions. So there's some great information and examples of various places where the penalties of this has kicked in. All right, so the Buy American Act versus Trade Agreements Act. So the Buy American Act applies to many supply construction contracts between the micro purchase threshold, that 10,000, because we're looking at just supplies for this example, and the so-called Trade Agreement Act threshold. So at the trade agreement threshold, not BA, applies to many contracts. So dependent upon which trade agreement is applicable, that sets the size standard for when the Trade Agreements Act comes in and then kind of supersedes the Buy American Act. And I've seen solicitations that had both, and that might not always be the correct use of having both clauses. And if there's confusion, that's where you want to talk to the contracting officer before that bid due date. So for example, here in the second bullet, currently the World Trade Organization thresholds are at 182,000 for most supply contracts and caps at 7 million for most construction. And so you can see the threshold. And those are revised every 2 years. Here is US.Trade.gov that has all of the threshold notices that are, if you're curious, for the various trade agreements. Also, for your information, if you want to see what all trade agreements are in play, you can see the full list here. 52.225-5 lists each one, and there's a great table that gives the minimum threshold for both supply, service, and construction for each trade agreement. The value of knowing when the trade agreements kicks in is because then we have the products, components that are manufactured in these countries for which the US has trade agreements, and those trade agreements remove that concern of whether it's domestic or non-domestic. That is the biggest takeaway today. So Buy American, yes, we need that, it's important. However, if we then the Trade Agreements Act kicked in because we are over these dollar thresholds, then that determination of whether it's domestic or non-domestic is waived if it's from a country under which we have a trade agreement. Just in case, because there's so much to follow. So if a Trade Agreement Act applies to a supply contractor, the contractor can provide US-made end products or a designated country end product. So that's the value of these trade agreements. And we now have designated countries where we can then substitute, and it has the same value for intent as a US-made end product. Then it comes down to really ultimately what is your better pricing. The Trade Agreement Act prohibits providing products and services that are not TAA eligible. So there are some exemptions. Again, I'm not going to really dig into the detail. You can look at the clause, right here, 52.225.5, because it goes into both the designated countries under whichever trade agreements, and you can see the list here, and it gets into the list of allowed and disallowed products. So the Trade Agreement Act does not apply to small business set-asides. So in this case, then the Buy American Act absolutely would rule supreme. And the acquisitions of certain war materials indispensable for national security. So again, Buy American Act, and we're going to really see those DoD Buy American Act program and the Barrie Act, depending on what the product is going to trump the Trade Agreement Act. Acquisitions of end products for resale, and this goes back to stocking commissaries and other, just that resale for federal government, and certain other acquisitions. And this is kind of a useless sentence, but really that's where you want to pay attention to the solicitation, the language of the solicitation. And if you are starting to get conflicting clauses that have been added, and possibly you have a newer contracting officer that's not understanding, it should be one or the other, if not then this, make sure that you're reaching out to those contracting officers. So unless there is language that simply exempts from either Buy American Act or for whatever reason, then usually can pull that justification as to why. GSA schedules, just talk about that in brief. The Trade American Act described in the FAR 25.4 applies to all schedule contracts and orders. The Trade Agreement Act, which provides a waiver to the Buy American Act, states that only US made or designated country end products may be offered and sold under schedule contracts. So if you're looking at GSA schedules, absolutely Buy American Act, and here is our bottom line of which one is applied. Okay, Trade American Act, here's our FAR clauses and our DFAR. I'm just going to pull that out for your reference, and please note that you're not going to see one without the other, that if there's a trade agreement or Buy American Act, there is always that partnering certificate. So there is, whenever you see either the TAA or BAA clause in your solicitation, there is also that clause that you have to fill out that certificate. Okay. So just real quick on the 25402, which is the trade agreements, it just, in essence, provides the authority for the president to waive the Buy American statute and other discriminatory provisions for eligible products from countries that have signed an international trade agreement with the US. Eligible products, we're going to hop down here to 403, the World Trade Organization. Again, eligible products from the World Trade Organization, GPA and FTA. So these are, again, trade agreements, are entitled to non-discriminatory treatment specified in, and here's that list. And I have had a lot of calls for businesses that have quoted their products, they have followed the clauses, and the end product that was being provided was not a US made, and then the contracting officer was rejecting it after contract award. But ultimately, then we're getting into, well, this was you also had the Trade Agreement Act involved in this, and this is a component from a country, in this case it was Canada, and they do have that trade agreement. And what the contracting officer was missing is that it waived that discriminatory provision and allowed those from these countries to be included, so domestic or, good heavens, I'm running out of words. Let's go ahead and just move on. Sorry about that little hiccup. All right, so again, exceptions. We're actually going to change and hop over to construction materials. Since this is the AGC, I imagine a lot of you attending today, this is what you're really interested in, this FAR clause regarding Buy American Act for construction materials. So it says when one of the following exception applies, and I have stripped down this clause just to highlight it. This is not the clause in full. The contracting officer may allow the contractor to acquire foreign construction materials without regard to restrictions of the Buy America statute. So here are those four: impractical or inconsistent with public interest, non-availability, unreasonable cost. Again, it's IT as a commercial item. So I did strip this down, but I wanted to have you be able to see this. So when you do have this construction material, Buy American Act construction materials clause, and in case of those concrete anchors, commercial item, and we don't have a US manufacturer, then that exception that we're falling under is that non-availability, or perhaps even unreasonable costs, where the American made component is 3 times the cost. And even if we applied that 6% or 12%, depending on for small business, large business, or in the case of a DoD, if we're applying that 50% preference penalty, that non-domestic end component is still the better. Here's the clause that supports that. The challenging thing is looking at the construction solicitation, looking at the clauses, and really how is that pricing component? Is this something that's easy to pull out or not? And this is where I was looking at a couple of solicitations yesterday, and one solicitation was for JBear, and when we were looking at the price sheet, even though it was construction, basically they were doing the price as a firm fixed price contract, and so everything was all inclusive. So what we weren't seeing is a breakout of all of the different construction components. And even though you're not seeing that broken out, you are still responsible under that particular solicitation to have that information available because it was a construction contract. This clause was in place, as well as the one for material certificate. You need to know those country of origin for material. And if you're not using domestic, then you need to be able to justify as to why. And then it's one of these, usually top 3: impractical, inconsistent, not available, unreasonable cost. The other solicitation I was looking at, the price portion for you to complete was about 6 pages long, and it broke out absolutely. It was a Department of Transportation, Federal Highways, and it was for a bridge repair in Denali, and the price page was about 6 pages long, and it broke out every bit of the construction components. And in that case, it'd be very easy for you to identify when you're filling out your pricing, domestic, non-domestic, and have your certificate to then match those line item price, whether you were domestic or non-domestic. Okay. Determination of findings. When a determination has been made for any reason stated in the section that certain foreign construction materials may be used, the contracting officer must list the accepted materials in the contract. This section B, I really want to encourage you that if you are seeing language such as brand name or equivalent, or they're calling out specific product, and then again, that particular product that they may be calling out by name may not be a domestic, and yet we have this particular FAR clause in there. Before that bid due date, when you have those conflicting clauses, instead of assuming that the contracting officer is necessarily going to apply all of this correctly, ask for clarification in writing before that bid due date. Okay, let's move on. So pre-award determinations, again, what we're kind of talking about, this is for the contract, one second. For the contracting officer, it says for any acquisition, an offeror may require the contracting officer a determination concerning the inapplicability of the Buy American statute for specific identified construction materials. So if we are looking at something that we just know from the start is not going to be an easy, or we're looking at that cost, you can request in writing, ask that question, and ask them to make a determination concerning the inapplicability. Give your reason. Some people say, well, we really don't want to do that. That may take our buying advantage. We know something better. But to me, asking those type of questions is really putting everybody on that same playing field where we're getting that response in writing of yes or no, it is going to apply or it's not going to apply. And maybe we can highlight specific subcomponents that absolutely will be the exception. And then we don't have to worry about that price uncertainty with our competitors after the bid due dates. Okay, evaluating offers of foreign construction. Again, this is things that we've already talked about, but I wanted to give you that clause. And I've just kind of highlighted it. So it talks about this 6%. So Barrie Amendment. So the Barrie Amendment, and this is my one and only slide, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The Barrie Amendment is originally passed in Congress in 1941 to promote the purchase of certain U.S. goods. So this statute prohibits DOD, so this is a Department of Defense only, from using funds to procure certain items that are not grown, reprocessed, reused, or produced in the United States. When it applies to certain listed products, and note, there is a list of products, it is a pure domestic requirement. There is no unreasonable cost exception unless an exception exists. Gotta love the FAR. This is absolute unless we tell you otherwise. And of course, usually the exception for national security, emergency, there's always those exceptions when deemed, and usually they're deemed at a headquarter level. So the Barrie Amendment is implemented through the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, so the DFAR 225/7002, and it only applies to DOT procurement activity, even if another agency is purchasing on the behalf of DOD. So again, that Barrie Amendment is just further strengthening that concept of that Buy American Act without the exceptions. And again, there's listed materials. It really looks at wartime supply, clothing. Again, these aren't things I'm not going to necessarily go into detail, but I did want to call this to your attention. So, in conclusion, one, I want to thank you all for hanging in there. And two, let me just pause before I do my last in conclusion. Okay, I don't see any questions yet, but here it all is in a nutshell. The Buy American Act requires federal agencies to procure domestic materials and products. Two conditions must be present. The procurement must be intended for public use, and the items procured or manufactured must be present in the U.S. in sufficient quantity, reasonably available in that commercial aspect. Under the Buy American Act, non-domestic products can be offered if they're not insufficient, again, not made or mined, manufactured in significant qualities, sufficient qualities, or two, the lowest domestic offer is under if another exception applies. Preference penalties are applied to non-domestic price. One thing I didn't list is you are allowed, and it states on one of the clauses that you are allowed to offer price options if you want to have both a domestic and a non-domestic option. So if you're worried about being deemed non-responsive by offering a non-domestic product, you can have an option, and it's stated right within the FAR clause for the Buy American Act. Trade agreements allow products or components from listed countries a waiver from the Buy American Act and other discriminatory provisions. Read your solicitation. Look for conflicts between the Buy American Act requirements, the Trade Act, and in some cases even the Barrie Act if you're looking at a Department of Defense. Ask for clarification before bid due dates, because there is language within the Buy American Act that simply states that if the contractor feels that the Buy American Act is not applicable for that particular solicitation, they must notify the contracting officer prior to the bid due date and ask for clarification of the act applicability. So keep that in mind. You're always welcome to question. Know the country of origin for your components materials priced in your proposal. Keep track of those. We have the case of a protest that someone's saying you're being non-responsive to the Buy American Act, and that's why you've won based on those price considerations. You have that supporting information ready from your bid. And two, finally, ensure that all required Buy American Act certificates have been completed and included in your proposal where required. So I see I have one more question. Okay, so Bill's asking, can I expand on the micro purchase clause? When does this apply? So what it's stating under that the Buy American Act is not applicable if the purchase is under the micro purchase threshold. So it depends if it's a construction, service, or supply. So can the your question continues, can the contractor purchase any item for use in a construction site regardless of the country of origin as long as the purchase is less than $2,000? So no, that is not quite applying it correctly, Bill. What that is, when we talk about the micro purchase threshold, we're talking about the agency purchasing under that micro purchase threshold. For example, if we have someone with that government purchasing card and they walk into Lowe's, AIH, any of these, and they're looking to buy construction materials and they're under, if they're just buying that supply, then they can purchase up to $10,000 before the Buy American Act kicks in. If you are responding to a solicitation that has that construction material, Buy American Act construction materials, then you need to look at the details of that clause and how it applies to your pricing of the entirety of all of the supplies solicitation. Mark, so I see we have a question. We are dealing with the AIS. Can you assist with these questions concerning this? Mark, are you the one that emailed me this morning about that? I actually, before I go into your question, Mark, I just want to let everyone know if you have any further questions, and want to hang out while we quick talk about the AIS, which right here, I pulled up information. And I am blanking on what that acronym stands for. So for those of you that are interested in this question, have any other questions, feel free to hang out. For any of those, our 1 o'clock time is up and you don't have any questions, thank you for joining me today. Feel free to download the handouts as well as the FAR 52 American Act in full. Let me know if you have any questions. So AIS, one of the things in this article really gave a good difference of what kicks in when you're looking at the Buy American Act. So the AIS, and what is that, American, oh, here we go, American Iron and Steel. This article gives a lot of great information, and I simply Googled BAA versus AIS, and this is one article I found out. So the Buy American Act is applicable, but this AIS, the American Iron and Steel, is further restricting the solicitation in this circumstance. So in other words, in this article, they're talking about this is EPA. If you have received funds from the EPA under funds from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund or Drinking Water Fund. So if you're a fund recipient, then the AIS is absolute, and that's going to be the statute that you fall under because it is in line with the Buy American Act, but then it is further restricting that Buy America Act with these specific things to American for the steel. The biggest difference it goes on to talk about is here. The act went back to when Buy America states that the compliance, so when we're talking about steel, you can get the component and then it can be further treated here in the US. So when we're talking about the Buy American Act, again, you're here that manufactured. The AIS goes into detail that all processes, it states right here, all process starting with the melting of the raw materials through coatings have to be done in the US. So these requirements apply to specific list of products as further defined by EPA guidance. So if you're looking at a solicitation that has that AIS, there are requirements. And if you have further question on it, shoot me an email so that we can talk to it specifically for the requirement that you're working on. Structural insulated panels. Thanks, Russ. Another good question. Canadian versus American shipping, about the same. 35K for building. So in your question, Russ, let me read the whole question real quick, and then let's see what kicks into play. Let me just make this bigger so I can read it. How about SIP, structural insulated panels, Canadian versus American shipping, about the same, say about 35K for building, 12K shipping, or a heater boiler that is 15K. So if you're looking at a solicitation for Canadian versus American, Canada has a trade agreement with America, and they can be exempted from that concern of whether domestic, non-domestic. They are a trade partner with the US. What you want to do is look at your solicitation and see if there are any clauses on that include that Trade Agreement Act. And if you look through the slides, I gave you that specific clause number, because ultimately that's going to give you a much more specific to say, aha, this is our defining. If it's just the Buy American Act, say we're under that dollar threshold, then you're looking at that cost comparison, and you're looking at that 6% or 12% if it's a civilian agency for that cost preference. If you're over the dollar threshold, you're not seeing any clauses in the Trade Agreements Act should be kicking in, because then I would ask the contracting officer for clarification, because what you really want before you put your bid in is to have that concern of whether it's domestic, non-domestic removed from the equation. And again, Russell, if that doesn't quite give you all of your question and the information you need in full, reach out to me when we can talk about your activity specifically. And real quick, last slide, let me just pull it up so you have what contact information is. So Mark has a question. It says, after reading the AIS, we're still having a hard time determining what materials fall under the Act and those which don't. So again, Mark, just go ahead and reach out to me when we can set an appointment and we can go over the activity much more specifically and get that exact information that you need. So, whew, quite an earful. So I can imagine you all, your ears are about as tired as me from going through and talking about all of this. So again, Buy American Act is very simple, even though there's just tremendous amount of language that really bogs it down. Look at it, look at your solicitation, look at how the applicable, and if you have questions or you feel that it's being implemented where it shouldn't, ask those questions to your contracting officer. If you want to take the time to really go into this more in depth to a particular solicitation or more specific to your company, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. My email address is jl8@alaska.edu. We're glad to set an appointment with myself or even Craig Von Holt. If you're in Fairbanks, reach out to Pierre. And let's get that information so that you are more confident in putting your bids together under these, either the Buy American Act or the Trade Agreements Act. So I am over my time by 5 minutes. I apologize for running late. I want to thank you everyone for joining me again today. If you're like me, where you need to let everything gel and then you come up with the questions after the fact, again, feel free to reach out at PTAC and let us know where we can help you. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and close this webinar and wish you guys all a fantastic afternoon.